Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Institute of Sacred Music, I'm Christian Wyman. I want to let you know that after the event, Kevin will be signing books, so please buy a book. Possible Futures is here selling books. We're glad to have him, and he'll be glad to sign them. It would take me the rest of this time, the rest of the hour, to go through all of Kevin's accomplishments, so I'm going to skip most of that. He's made immense and lasting contributions as a writer, a teacher, an editor, and a curator. That last most recently as the director of the Smithsonian's African American Museum. He's the poetry editor of The New Yorker, where he also hosts a fantastic podcast, and he's the editor of The Definitive History of African American Poetry, published by the Library of America, a wonderful book if you don't have it. But all of that comes out of the poetry, from the solitary work of consciousness that Kevin's been faithful to for 40 years. Maybe longer, I don't know when you started writing. Of all his achievements, it's this one, I believe, that will prove to be most durable. I first met Kevin we couldn't quite figure out the dates, but something like 35 years ago at Stanford in the last workshop that Denise Levertov would teach. She was just a bit grumpy by that point in her life, but a fiery and provocative foil for us nonetheless. We both talked a lot about her today and really admired her a lot. Kevin was 21, I think, fresh out of Harvard and studying with Seamus Heaney. I was very jealous about that. I was 24 or 25, something, and fresh out of a 20-foot trailer in far west Texas. I think the meeting was a shock for both of us, but we immediately recognized a kinship. We were both obsessed with the sound of poems, both driven by that. In the past 4 decades, I can't tell you how often I've been heartened and bolstered by Kevin's fidelity to that drive. It's the quality I would most urge you to pay attention to during his reading. Kevin's learned a lot from music, specifically African American music, and he's written on that beautifully as well. And his lines are electric with syncopation, shifts in register, words whose meanings fracture in multiple ways at once. The miracle is that amid all this, the poems remain remarkably clear. He's fused the best parts of modernism, which the movement as a whole mostly kept separate. One's aesthetic and has to do with discovering a new style, new forms of expression. The other is thematic and involves bringing in new material and voices to poetry. One tends to be difficult. One tends towards clarity and apparent simplicity, often clarity over great depth. Kevin, like Gwendolyn Brooks, refuses to pick a side and takes the best of both traditions. Much the same is true of his relation to religion. Is there faith without belief, he asks in this new book. Yes, it's known as life in these parts. I've learned a lot about poetry, life, and faith from Kevin Young, and I'm thrilled to have him here after all these years to read from this extraordinary new book. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Chris. We've had a great time these past days, just reminiscing about those days back then. And it was such a special time to be in Denise's class and to be there writing and learning writing and trying out things, and to be here together years later is really special to me. And thank you all for coming out. As you can see from my copy of the New Yorker anthology that I did, there's a lot of praise in this book. I went through trying to figure out how I was going to sort of read just a couple things from it. And I'm ending up really thinking about the first and the last poem, which were some things I actually instantly, when I was asked to do the New Yorker book of poems, a century of poetry, the New Yorker, it was, a kind of process of, yes, of course, I went through 100 years and thousands of poems. We published 13,500 poems over that time. And this book has about over 800 and over 500 poets, including Chris. And so what was really special was to try to think about how it's really shaped by praise, I realized. starting with a poem that you probably know, Try to Praise the Mutilated World, by Adam Zagajewski, which you might recall appeared on the back page of the New Yorker after 9/11, just the whole back page. And the way it sort of thinks about praise, I think, is really important, because for me, praise is really that recognition in another object or person of something of the self and something beyond the self. You could call it divine even. And I think so much about what Lucille Clifton, the wonderful poet, said about what poetry is meant to do. And she says, poetry is meant to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And I love that formulation. I also love thinking about, the way I tend to think about it is, it tends to make the ordinary extraordinary and make the extraordinary ordinary, or rather kind of recognize that those things often are that way, that the ordinary is such an important, everyday, powerful thing. And this poem thinks about that in many ways. Try to Praise the Mutilated World by Adam Zagajewski. Try to praise the mutilated world. Remember June's long days and wild strawberries, drops of wine, the dew, the nettles that methodically overgrow the abandoned homesteads of exiles. You must praise the mutilated world. You watched the stylish ships and yachts. One of them had a long trip ahead of it, while salty oblivion awaited others. You've seen the refugees heading nowhere. You've heard the executioners sing joyfully. You should praise the mutilated world. Remember the moments when we were together in a white room and the curtain fluttered. Return in thought to the concert where music flared. You gathered acorns in the park in autumn and leaves eddied over the earth's scars. Praise the mutilated world and the gray feather a thrush lost and the gentle light that strays and vanishes and returns. So that framed the book in many ways. It kicked it off. Because one of the things I want to do is really think about the century behind us. And what I love about poetry, and specifically the New Yorker, how the New Yorker often was there when, along the way that poetry charted our time, poetry that was both timely and timeless at its best. And during my time at the New Yorker, COVID happened, as well as the reckoning of 2020. And, I was picking poems already. It wasn't like the picking of poems was new, but suddenly it became, for me, really freighted, and thinking about that witnessing that poetry does, if not its prescience. And so one of the poems we ended up running is called by Ada Limon, the most recent poet laureate, now followed by Arthur Z. Happily. And this is called The End of Poetry. So this ran during COVID, but was written before it, which I think is important. But in a moment of us not being able to hug or see each other often, this poem, I think, spoke to that moment. The end of poetry. Enough of osseous and chickadee and sunflower and snowshoes, maple and seed, samara and shoot. Enough chiaroscuro. Enough of thus and prophecy and the stoic farmer and faith and our Father and 'tis of thee. Enough of bosom and bud, skin and God not forgetting, and star bodies and frozen birds. Enough of the will to go on and not go on, or how a certain light does a certain thing. Enough of the kneeling and the rising and the looking inward and the looking up. Enough of the gun, the drama, and the acquaintance's suicide, the long-lost letter on the dresser. Enough of the longing and the ego and the obliteration of ego. Enough of the mother and the child and the father and the child, and enough of the pointing to the world, weary and desperate. Enough of the brutal and the border. Enough of, can you see me? Can you hear me? Enough, I am human. Enough, I am alone and I am desperate. Enough of the animal saving me. Enough of the high water, enough sorrow, enough of the air and its ease. I am asking you to touch me. That's Ada. So I wanted to start with the poems of Night Watch, which I'll mainly be reading from. And what I was struck by when I was writing this book is the ways that it's organized I'm not struck by, I made it, but it's in 4 parts, and the first part, it gets longer as it goes along, and the first part is just one poem called Cormorant, which is really about my father, who's from Louisiana, both my parents are, and his memory of the place, but also about that beautiful bird, that ugly beauty, as Thelonious Monk would say. Cormorant. Nobody's angel, even your crown, unkempt, looks like an egret in an oil slick. Inelegant pelican diving down to feed, burnt goose, orphaned stork, you skim close to the water. Nigger bird, we called you, laughing. I've seen you perched on a stump in a swamp, drying your waxless wings, raised like a crucifix, unpraised. Black swan, you flood back to me among the memory of my father driving home, his hands a map, pointing out shacks where Negroes once lived, now only timber and anger still there for him forever. Besmirched crow cousin, dirty seraph, today you are enough. You'll do. If only I could see you again, hungry, waiting at the edge of the bayou. The second section, as I said, is a little longer. It's called All Souls, and I won't read it tonight, though it's sort of the season of All Souls coming up upon us. I thought instead I would read from the third section, which is called The Two-Headed Nightingale, and it refers to Millie Christine McCoy, Millie Ann Christine, though she often referred to herself as singular and because she was a conjoined twin. And what I was so interested in is her life, which is so fascinating. She was born enslaved, she was stolen and then displayed across the country, including by P.T. Barnum. Her parents sued for her freedom, but also for damages, and they won, which is hard to believe in this moment. And freed, she, sang across the world. She apparently had an amazing voice, if you can imagine how close those harmonies were. She sang for Queen Victoria, and she eventually died in the Carolinas, having bought back the property that she was enslaved on. She also was, in a funny twist of fate, in land near the original Siamese twins, Chang and Eng. So there's a lot going on. But I was really interested in the ways that this duality, this singleness that she experienced and spoke of. She spoke of herself as this wondrous, miraculous being. How it helped me at least, think through some of the doubleness, but also the divide that she speaks of in the poem. It's a time of division in America when she was alive, during the Civil War and after. And this was a book that I had written, and it felt like it wasn't quite right time. It felt sort of dark. I had put it in a drawer and pulled it out in 2020, and I was like, it feels kind of accurate. I don't know. This is now a division that speaks to now, I hope, in some way, though she's thinking a lot about also the division between the body and the soul, the self and other, herself and community. So I'll just read some from her poem. We was born blue, conjoined, but breathing. Both of us at once, body and soul entwined, twinned, we sang our cries for comfort, for air, and for our mother whose water we once swam like a man thrown overboard, clutching driftwood, our faces smooth that we shared. Even a stone has a soul. We was torn from mother's bosom soon after we was born, soon as we could sing 2 yolks and 1 egg. Nightingale, they called us, made us one, not twin. Our harmonies are disguise. As the sun is stolen by the night, we were taken in daylight from our mother, our father, our souls broken, body stolen from her who once we were one with. We hollered in unison for milk, for more, our arms are clocks. The seconds never did hold enough. The agony of being alive, of a body and soul both entwined. If ever one day she died before I, would I perish too? Is there a moment between death of the body and the beyond? It is this gap we live in, who have never known alone. When you slept, I slept. When you dreamt, I did too. When Sunday was sent, we sang. When we could, we filled the woods with dark notes, each of us an echo. And this is the last poem in the sequence. What the daffodils decide early to do, bloom. Our body decides to. The crooked dogwood, the pear tree, a crabapple is grafted onto. Both bear their fruit. The bitter, not quite apples, the pear tree entwined around itself. This the ivy found. Tomorrow we'll be buried together, wedded and dead, past the deepest weeds. I shall go first, then follow. The blossoms blizzard all around. Tomorrow a cold spell, unexpected, will frost the crowded ground. So the last section of the book is called Darkling, and it's a long sequence. It's based on Dante, or more accurately, it started as a response to Robert Rauschenberg's illustrations for Dante's Inferno. He made these illustrations one at a time, hearing the cantos read to him. And I was really struck by that and was asked by MoMA, sometimes people say, to write about it. And so I did. With me and the wonderful Robin Cost-Lewis split up the Inferno. I kept the devil, but did the first part for the most part. And what I was interested in, I think, was just the ways that reacting to the art, but also to Dante, and also to this notion of hell, which was raging all around us even then. But I kept going. I told no one and kept going with purgatory and some version of heaven. So I think I'll read around in that. This is a poem called Beyond. What if the body is what we bring with us beyond? It is the soul stays here, sullen, unconsolable, not so much wandering as waiting to be found, reunited, dirtied in the end. It is enough, then, to see the soul let loose only in those moments of ecstasy, not when we leave our body, but when our body arrives finally and our soul sups, fed like the dead, hands hungry as stray gloves. Fingers may fill them, but still they need the noun of the soul. The soul's smell, its plangent personhood. The more they eat, the more they need. The body always becoming, who verbs its way over and under, while the soul rocks in the old folks' home. The soul who shivers, grown suddenly cold. This is called The Depths. The dead, newborn, need learn a new tongue, must learn to live with a body and not inside one. The innards symphony, river of blood. Enough, the infants cry. Too much, say the dead, who prefer to live without pain or its opposite, grace. The dead all share the same fate, memory, the figurehead of a ship, salt-worn, grimaced, arms akimbo, fording the faceless sea. This is called Black Spring. I hate the heart. How it ain't ever done finds its way forward, though the head may not want. We may have to say, let go to those we love. It's all right to leave, not permitted to stay. That very night, absolved, stigmatted with tubes, they up and do. The world apparently is hard to fight free from, rocketing away from gravity and the cherry trees blooming early, before I was even ready to believe again in beauty. I'll read this slightly longer sequence called The Ninth Circle, or it's just called Ninth Circle. And Dante, as you recall, pictures hell as the bottom of hell as a cold place, not a fiery one, which is somehow creepier, you know. And so this poem dances with that. Ninth Circle. The season stolen. The cold comes without a word. I wish you would. I save all the smallest things, which one day I'll braid into a bloom that tries to live beyond these bare rooms. How the soul slanders the body, calls it a vessel or temple, either way, empty, unfulfilled. How the body buries the soul, rends and does not mend it, broken like a spirit or the soul's shiny bones which grow. The dead grow more distant each day, like their fingernails or the future. Nights nearer, squint and you can see them. The dead visit in the taint between sleep and waking, between being a body and being aware of one, the shades shutting out, no more light. Pity the body, how it outlasts even its clothes. No, how its clothes outshine it. Better to live beyond everyone you know, left mourning oneself. I saw the sun decide to rise, though I thought it would rather not, wanting to sleep longer, forever and a day. Who knows what the cold is called by those who cannot feel it, the dying, anymore? The Antarctic explorer, soldier, rations running out, declares, I am just going outside and maybe sometime, knowing full well he'll be found never or much later. His words, ice, all of ours, what no thought can thaw, coating like ash our lids and lashes. Maybe a little purgatory for us? Have we had enough hell? This is called Ledge. What I love about Dante's conception of purgatory is, of course, it's this mountain, but it's also a set of stairs. It's a climb. It's a place, as he describes it, with hope. That's the difference between purgatory and hell for him. Ledge. No use telling the dead what you've learned, since they've learned it too. How to go on without you. The mercy of mourning or moving. The light that persists, even if. Beauty is as beauty does, my mother says, who is beautiful, and speaks loud so she can be understood. unlike poets who can't talk to save their lives, so they write. It's like a language loss can be learnt only by living there. What anchors us to this thirst and earth, its threats and thinnesses, its ways of waning and making the most of worse and much worse, if not this light lifting up over the ridge. Necropolis, Garden of Stone. Today, cleaning, I found shots of my trip to Cuba, legally, back when that was still possible. The blurred lights of Havana from above, the heat that greeted you at night at the airport, 1,000 taxi drivers in the dark. The hot rods we rode in were from an America now rotting in barns or were stored in a rich man's garage. Later, we'd ride one to the necropolis, miles and miles of the dead, of monuments and small homemade shrines, aren't they all? A bird's green wing, a doll of a child, not a toy, you understand. Tourists wanting to take pictures of even the girl doll in her fading dress, as if the dead need nothing except our memories, palm trees swaying among the stones, and just beyond, near the fence, the smolder and smoke and scent, not unpleasant, of coffins now empty or emptied, being burnt. So when the book was done, I realized I'd put all the writers in purgatory. I hadn't meant to, I promise, but they have hope, of course. Ditch. Day he died, Samuel Beckett's father, doctor said, was doing better. Doctor scarcely out the door when dear dad collapsed, sweet pea all over his face. At the promise, Beckett had donned the brightest clothes he could find. Later watched last words fall from dad's pained mouth. Fight, fight, fight. And what a morning. 3 days after, Beckett wrote his friend, I cannot write about him. The letter proof to the contrary. I can only walk the fields and climb the ditches after him, his father buried between the mountains and the sea. God love thee, Sam. So a little bit of paradise for you. Faith. How do the small birds in the street know how not to die? That whatever they gather, hunger for, is never enough to keep them in the road when our wheels bear down upon them. They feast on what I cannot see, then fly away and sing. This poem's called Diptych, Portraits of Light, and it's a diptych, so there's two parts, but you know that. But it's the part of the book that names the book. So the first section is called Night Watch. Night Watch. You can fall in love in a museum, but only with the art or its silence. Or the stranger you don't mean to follow, suffering past the old masters and the unnamed servants. Rembrandt's face, half in shadow. You can fall for what isn't there already, or with the 13th century, the swan raising up, roosters hung upside down to die on a cross. Even the tourists gathered round the docent, the same jokes and half-truths loom beautiful. The children crying hurried out of sight. Forget the night watch, the crowds. Instead, follow the quiet to the portraits of light entering a room. These walls, few windows, hold the world, what the world couldn't say till someone saw it first, and now it's everywhere. The braids of that woman's hair. Self-portrait with felt hat. One should never be in love when in a museum. Better to be alone, if not utterly, than practically, tired of feet and routine. Forge ahead beyond the bounds of audio tours and family isolate. Avoid this couple oblivious to it all, the captions and arrows, kissing like no tomorrow beside Van Gogh's sunflowers. Bruised chartreuse, brilliant and wilting for years, yet never managing to. Skip holding hands and Gauguin's portrait of Van Gogh painting what he saw. The crows gather like clouds, black, or the crowds. That the couple doesn't care about, numb to all else. Best believe in the world more than yourself. And I'll end with these two. This is called Yellow Jacket. Yellow Jacket. The way wasps want your house to be their house, so the dead try to make your home their own. They move in promising to stay only a week, luggage stuffed with old clothes and tinted photographs, building their houses of paper, buzzing. They draw the curtains, de-silver the mirrors, till years later look about, and it's your life the dead are living. Wake and rub the night from your eyes, the paper fetched wet from the yard, the paid death notices and ads for living longer unread. Mine, not the wings for such a flight. Each day, later than you like, the lonely postman force feeds words into the hungry mouth of the mailbox, where this small dudding bird has begun its brittle, briefest nest. And the last poem I'll read is called Hereafter. It was a poem that I tried to write for years, and because it's about something that happened, and sometimes that's what happens, is you try to write for a while. So here it is. Hereafter. Once, in winter, I was blessed by lightning. The plane sudden struck, the boom of it. The cabin lit up, and then the air made metal in my mouth. It's true. You can look it up. We had circled like hell, trying to land a good while. Once even descended through clouds of snow, earthbound, only to rise again, the last moment when a plane already sat there, blinking on our white runway. Exiled back to the sky, we orbited the airport untethered and impatient. So when lightning threaded us through, we all knew. Wrong, it turns out. Yet one day, true enough, perhaps soon, we'd be done. You should know that after you're ready to meet the far, stony shore, it is not hope, but the strange fire of forgiveness that flares and fights there, not wanting to go, hoping only you'd said so long to all you knew, to the elms who also know what it means to be told you die and survive. In that emptied, electric air, some wept. Others asked to help or for help, began to act as if it was merely static that snagged us aloft. How long did we linger up there in thunder, thinking mostly of all I loved, of what I'd never write, mirror of my mind. Once we kissed the earth again, fire trucks ushered us through the open gates where the 5 o'clock news asked what I'd seen, and the woman I loved picking me up talked a blue streak till she heard the between we'd been. Quiet then. We fetched my luggage, orbiting the conveyor belt, unspooling its rosary. We drove home in snow deep and silence. This little living light. Even now, how to name just how bright the sky looked that night and most the next day. Hard to believe, one instant you could be beyond the earth's reach, the next, marveling at our singed, wounded wings. Thank you. There you go. How's everyone doing tonight? Good.
Okay,
Great
so
to see you.
Kevin, my first question has to do with that poem you just read.
Oh, no.
Yeah, you said it's not hope that you feel in that moment, but the strange fire of forgiveness, something like that?
Yes.
So what, forgiveness from whom? For yourself, or?
That's a great question. I think I meant it forgiving others as well as the self. You know, I think before my father died, you know, you're working stuff out. You know, it's not always easy to be a father, have a father, be a son, all the things. And I remember when he died, I thought, you know, we had repaired whatever, you know, slight, just normal kind of bumps in the road we had. And I remember he, in fact, called me, and my girlfriend at the time, who later we got married, and she was like, who were you talking to? Because we had so much fun, you know. We're like laughing, you know, in that way. It was the last conversation. I was so thankful for that. But also when he died, which was very sudden, an accident, I was like, oh, there's nothing to forgive, you know. And it was kind of in that moment, I think I say that in another poem, but here it was sort of like, oh, I forgive you know, there's nothing, like being on the other side, I felt like no one has to apologize to me, you know, like in this weird moment of, I don't know, it meant so much more to not have been able to say goodbye. That was one's fear, at least in that moment for me.
That's quite a blessing.
Yes.
To have nothing to forgive. I also wanted to ask about hope. I wanted to ask you this because I had lunch with a colleague a couple of days ago, and she's writing a book on hope, and she's been going around the country asking people what they hope for. And one of the biggest surprises has been that people say nothing. And I wonder...
They hope for the ordinary, or they have no hope left?
I think the latter.
Oy.
I wonder if you were asked that question. It really surprised me. Like,
Yeah.
what do you hope for?
Try to praise the mutilated world.
Oh.
You know, like, I love how in that poem he says, you must. Then he says, you should. These are different things. Try, must, should. And I've been thinking a lot about the attempt, you know, the essay, trying. That quality, I think, is so important right now. How do you know, to say, we got to praise the mutilated world is like, you know, later for you. Like, how dare you tell me? But to say try is an invitation. And the things he says are specific. They aren't all roses, right? And I love that in the, you know, End of Poetry poem, where she's sort of saying enough of all these things that have, in a way, gotten us through, you know, enough of this, enough of that. And some is despair, and some is like what I think she means as kind of easy consolation. And instead, she's saying, I am asking you to touch me, this, which I don't think is just physical, but in the moment when that poem appeared, in the midst of one of our bleaker moments, it felt like then, at least, she was asking for this human thing. Yeah. I had a friend who, for various reasons, you know, he was sort of in a pod of one, you know, and I called him once, and he was just, I could tell, I called our mutual friend and said, somebody's got to go get this guy. He is not supposed to be alone and not have touched anyone. And, you know, as soon as, you know, someone got him, he started crying and said, no one's touched me in 6 weeks or 8 weeks or, wow. You know, and that kind of isolation, unless you choose it, is really tough, I think. And even if you choose it, it's tough. But, you know, here we are wrestling with these kinds of questions of, now we can, but it feels like we're farther apart than ever, further apart. So I don't know, this kind of reconciliation question always haunts me, and it's somewhere in this book, Between the Dead and the Living.
You mentioned in the prose book that you mentioned, which I have here. I want you to read something from it before we finish, but you mentioned talking about Charlie Parker, the notion of plenty.
Yes.
Can you say a little bit about that?
I can say plenty.
Yeah.
I think that this idea of plenty is so important to me. I mean, I'm a maximalist and collect a lot of stuff and love that kind of thing. But I also think it's an important notion in African American culture. Some of it I take from Zora Neale Hurston, where she says, in Characteristics of Negro Expression, she talks about ornamentation and the need to ornament. And she says, it's a belief that there is never enough beauty, much less never too much beauty. Mm-hmm. And this idea that beauty is, there's that wonderful Andre, my brain is just fried, Andre, the wonderful designer and guy from Vogue magazine.
Oh, I won't know.
Yes, Andre Leon Talley, thank you. He has that wonderful quote. He's like, I am starved for beauty. He's like, there's a famine of beauty. And I think he's saying something that he doesn't mean little b beauty. He means like beauty, grace, like the whole thing. But he also means this will to adorn, this wish for plenty, right? And sometimes we forget that, how, especially if you grew up with not enough, you might want a lot. And both my parents grew up with less than most anyone I ever met, and they were both born at home in Louisiana. And, the fact that they survived like everyone did, I mean, it is a miracle sometimes. And, so just that idea of plenty, to me, is the sound coming out of Charlie Parker's horn.
Although part of that, you relate actually to the houses that you grew up in, and you talk about the way that they were covered with various pictures, calendar.
Yeah, sure. Like my grandparents' house, like there wasn't a mirror that didn't have other stuff on it.
Right.
So you have like tucked in the corner, like a card you got about Jesus, a devotional, and then like maybe someone's third grade picture, someone else's picture taped to that with another, like the pictures were kind of these static but beautiful things that also somehow in their layering spoke to a kind of memory or a kind of pushback against erasure.
And then you have this line, which I loved: beauty is not a state of being, but a kind of belief, seeing past what is to what may be.
Man, I was smart once.
Yeah.
That said it better than I could have. And for me, I was also interested, especially in that part where I was talking about sort of bebop and post-war jazz, and like Billie Holiday and glamour, and this kind of erasure of glamour. Like, I'm saying sort of the same thing in all these forums. As Andre Leon Talley, and this idea that, glamour means, of course, to like sort of put someone under a spell. And growing up in the 70s, black culture was like so glamorous, and I was in Chicago for a year as a little kid. I remember going into the Johnson Publishing Company, which had, a skyscraper, which also was just amazing. And you walk in, and there was this lobby that was so grand and glamorous, and it's still like my platonic ideal of the lobby of, my beautiful penthouse that I don't have, So, and that I sort of, it wasn't just that, it was like the afros and the bigness of black culture asserting itself, but also secure in itself, and I think that's still there, but sometimes we end up, worrying over much, and I think there was something about that kind of grace there that I miss. But you didn't ask that, did you?
Well, that's good. I mean, the quote actually makes me think of justice.
Yes.
Seeing past what is to. Do you know that poem by Anne Carson, God's Justice?
Yeah. My religion makes no sense and something else, and therefore I practice it.
That's in the same series, but the poem God's Justice is, on the day God went to make justice, he got involved making a dragonfly. He lost track of time and got involved making a dragonfly. And the rest of the poem is just the dragonfly.
Yeah.
The description of the dragonfly.
Sure.
So my question is, do you see a connection? Because a lot of people would think, well, how can we think of beauty when the world's going to hell?
How can we not, I think writing, in the midst of a war, does one write love poems? Can you? I think sometimes, Zagajewski or someone else might say you must. You must try. So that's some of what I think. And beauty can be as much a form of resistance as joy.
Yeah.
And that idea that joy is a form of resistance is from a poet, Toy Derricotte, you probably know. And her, just titling a poem it's not an easy poem. And we were talking about this today about Lucille Clifton signing her books Joy with an exclamation point. And I always understood, and especially come to know as I got to know Lucille more, it wasn't like, yay! It was like joy after long struggle and suffering, and it's a verb, in her rendering.
Yeah, and the Polish poet Anna Kamińska has a note about joy, saying it's not just a gift; it's an obligation. And then she says, "Courage."
Courage.
Yeah, exactly.
I wrote a friend that yesterday.
Yeah. I want to ask something else about Lucille, but I wanted to ask. So, given that notion of plenty, see, you seem to me like a maximalist person. You're very productive. You put out all these
How
things.
dare you?
But I wonder where you situate. Before I say what I think, I wonder where you situate yourself in relation to that.
Yeah, I think it's a sense of plenty. I think it also came from a sense of like being the family archivist, being the person who kept the thing that we were told didn't matter and then later is worth something. It comes from both sides of my family. I'm, just in a practical matter, I come from a long line of pack rats, You
did that even when you were young?
Yeah. I think in a way when we knew each other is when I started like collecting books and things. And there were so many great bookstores in San Francisco where I lived. There were probably 10 great used bookstores just in blocks of radius. And I was struck by how many books were in there that I didn't know about. This is true everywhere, I suppose. But like to see, these black poets or, older, anthologies of black writing or leftist writing or, women writers and be like, why didn't anyone come to my house and give me this book? Yeah. And so I would just get it, or a first edition of Native Son, for cheap, and I would find one and just be like blown away by the information in the actual book itself that, gets lost when you move from a first edition, and for me, it's not about, collecting, say, books, isn't about like value or some rarefied thing, it's about that information. That's how I knew, for instance, that Langston Hughes' last book was called Ask Your Mama, which is a great title for anything. 12 Moods for Jazz is the subtitle, and it's a very different poem for him. It's long lines. It's like a score. It has like notation on the side. It's a long poem. It's on pink salmon pages, and it was published by Knopf, and which later became my publisher. So I always admired the way that they rendered this book. It's oblong. It's different. And it's not easy. It's not like taught or around even now. And so it was the only way I could read it is getting that edition. And I still remember thinking, God, we were on the Stegner when it paid like nothing. And so I remember talking down the bookseller, which seemed like from a big price to a little price. And I found the book recently. It was $35. I think I talked him down to $30, which was a lot, but like here it is. I'm giving you Langston Hughes across the centuries, this book that I still have 35 years later. So it was a good investment. And to me, it's a broader thing than just books or things. It's this idea of knowledge and what we keep and what we value.
So that fits in with the notion of plenty. I guess the reason I ask the question is because I find your poems filled with silences. Like even what you read, there's all kinds of silence threaded through them. And I just wonder is that something you have to reconcile with the other ambition or something just that occurs naturally or?
Yeah, in the Gray album, I say this about hip-hop, like hip-hop loves silence, Jazz loves silence. There's that moment in hip-hop, they often will stop the music entirely. DJ will do that too. And I go on to say, it does it by combating it at every turn, like the loudness of hip-hop is also about the silence and, sometimes the violence that it's talking about or interested in. Its willingness to cut up a record and to, not violence per, gun violence, but a notion of sort of redoing everything. Let's start over. Let's remix. Let's break. you know? And I hear that in, Miles Davis. He's in love with silence. And you have to, when you hear him, you're hearing his tone, of course, but you're hearing those in a silent way, these kind of notes. So for me, especially in this book, it had to be starker than, a lush landscape of, someone like Bob Kaufman, who I love, who was a Black Beat poet, born in New Orleans, but then took a vow of silence between Kennedy's assassination and the end of the Vietnam War. And this idea of silence as, protest is sort of baked into Black thought and culture as well. How do you get past it? But it isn't about ignoring silence, it's like dancing with it. And so hopefully the poems do that.
How'd you come across Kaufman? There's an essay on Kaufman.
There's an essay, a whole chapter in that book. Kaufman was a kind of saint to us in the Darkroom Collective, the group of Black writers I was in based in Boston. And, he wrote a book called The Golden Sardine, which is just kind of weird, almost, Maltese Falcon, like the MacGuffin, that isn't really talked about. It's this kind of phrase he dreamt in a dream or something. And so I used to have I think it went the way of the wind, but this Darkroom t-shirt someone made with a little golden sardine on it, just said Darkroom and had a golden sardine. And he was someone we talked about and thought about, and we were really interested in recouping these lost writers who weren't really lost. And Kaufman was on New Directions. He was quite, for his first book, and then he was on City Lights and was seen as the Black Rimbaud, was very popular at one point in France, like Jerry Lee Lewis. So he was huge, and at the same time was unknown and was silent. And he even talked about it. He said, the first line of one of his poems is called, "I want to be buried in an anonymous crater on the moon," He kind of was, again, toying with silence and playing with it. So he was just one of our heroes. And then, as I say in the essay, I got like $500 to go to San Francisco and do research on him, which mostly involved going to bars,
Well, I wanted to ask you, is that part of your urge to do these anthologies, is to rescue things?
Certainly at times it's been.
The reason I ask is that I came across a poet named Ralph Dickey in the African American. I'd
Yeah.
never heard of him.
Yeah.
And I ended up writing something about him.
Oh, good.
Yeah, but I don't.
I mean, I think when you're doing, it's a funny thing, because I don't know if I think of it as rescuing in that instance. I think of it as more honoring the tradition, which is full and rich. How do you capture that? The hardest thing was like cutting down Gwendolyn Brooks from 50 pages, to 20 or something. At the same time, that was because there's 20 other poets who need a hearing in those other pages. And how do you kind of balance giving you the heart of Langston Hughes, who of course could be book after book and has book after book, but also kind of represent the fullness of the tradition, some of which was always important to us in the darkroom, but also to me as a poet. I love the weirdo poets, and we were at the Stegner, which was somewhat conservative. I mean, it was new critical and had this kind of legacy of that. And then I left there and went to Brown, which was very experimental in poetry and still is. And so that was a great balance for me of thinking about orthodoxies and going beyond them. And that's what I came to hate, are these sort of orthodoxies we have. And that requires you to read a little deeper. And, not everyone, I was at the Schomburg when I finished it, and not everyone had a city block of all of Black literature upstairs, And so how do you represent some version of that and have that kind of discovery that I had either growing up or in the process of doing the book? And so that's why I wanted that. It was more about discovery for me than rescuing.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to pick up on what you said about rap and the connection between music and your poetry, and I want you to read this little bit, Bring the Noise, because I think my students will enjoy it, and also it is incredible.
This part, Bring the Noise?
Yeah, and it ends right there.
Okay. I'm talking about Grandmaster Flash, I think. One of Flash's crew, Grand Wizard Theodore, is credited with discovering scratching, that way of not just rewinding the song, as Grandmaster Flash did to preserve the breaks, but turning the turntables into a percussive instrument, much as the African slave had turned the body, and Thelonious Monk the piano. Such scratching sought an itch, also found in scatting, beep, bop, boop, boop, and the gospel hum, that liquefying of words, as well as in falsetto with its machining of the voice. Scratching meant a machining of words, a realization that the voice can be physical, and that speech isn't just spoken but uttered by a body language or by black wax. Scratching made music from noise, declaring with a gesture that the marred world could be manipulated or disfigured even further in order to preserve and protect against the future shock that threatened the end of the break in the record. Scratching, like the gospel hum, suggests infinity. And you want me to keep going?
If you don't mind.
No,
just
no
tell
worries.
me
I just was. He has some notes in here. I'm like, what? I want to read them. Wherever white Christian culture and the secular culture that stemmed from and circulated around it took the biblical imperative to make a joyful noise, it tended to emphasize the joyful part. Black culture tries rendering the noise part, not just by saying it loud, but by rescuing all that seeming racket and even equating it with joy. Given static, make something ecstatic. No wonder one of the first important studies of hip-hop is called black noise.
I love that. Given static, make something ecstatic, but every bit of that is wonderful. The liquefying, the machining of the voice.
Can I tell you a funny story about that? So I was traveling a lot when I was writing that last chapter, which was, or last chorus it's called, about hip-hop. And I was flying around, and I was saving my files, but I wasn't printing out, which I usually do. And this was a little early that you wouldn't send it to the cloud or anything. So I land in my house, and I'm go one day to open, and I'm on a roll. I think I had 100 pages, just writing a white hot heat. And I turn on my computer and it goes rah, 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 like a car, and I just look, and it's nothing. And I go, oh my God. And it was talk about faith. I had to believe that maybe there was, and I remember driving to the Apple store with that horrible panic, may you never know it, that everything is gone, And I get to the store, and I remember he looked at something, and he's like, well, it's failing, but I can see it there. I was like, please just take that one file. But it almost, I had to have that weird moment, the total opposite of, being in the sky and confronting loss. What would you do if this thing disappeared? And part of all that I'm saying there is about memory and trying to, hip-hop's desire. I say it's like looking for a haystack in a needle, and hip-hop's desire to remember and retain, and it's always talking about the past, and it's literally made up of old stuff that you've recycled and reimagined. And so to think about losing all that was both fitting and terrifying, but it worked out.
I knew someone who was at the Stegner Fellowship at the same time, maybe a little later.
They
but
lost the whole novel.
Lost the whole novel, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Did they rewrite it, or it was gone?
I don't know. I think it's just gone. I think it just.
Man.
In the same.
Save your work, kids.
A little bit later in that same section, you talk about Johnny Cash, and quite a swerve. And related to poetry, and then you say, after the goodbye, not the long far away, but the hello after.
Say that again.
After the goodbye, not the long far away, but the hello after.
Uh-huh.
Remember that?
No. It was 15 years ago, so I get a little pass. Oh, is this in the deadism part?
You say, we should write you talk about Cash, and then you say, we should write a poetry that is after the goodbye, that is not the long farewell, but the hello after.
Yeah.
The hereafter, and that's the poem a poem that you ended with, a word that in itself is undead, both here and gone at the same time. I'm a long gone daddy, and being here and being gone seems what we need now. So the question I wanted to ask is, what does that look like, writing a poetry that's after the goodbye, that is not the long farewell, but the hello after?
I think, what I was interested in the end of that book was, hip-hop people thought of as the death of music, but it's so concerned with loss and life after death, even someone like Biggie Smalls or Notorious B.I.G., who seems so joyful, but all his work, like spread love is the Brooklyn way, right? But there's also this kind of menace in all that work. Someone like DMX is constantly obsessed with that, since we're talking hip hop. But there's a kind of resurrection that happens. And in this sort of essay, I almost wanted to write a kind of anti-manifesto called Deadism. And so I was thinking about, like, people always say, poetry's dead. Like, if you want to get published, you don't, in an essay, you can't write an essay like, poetry's doing just fine. Nope. Write an essay called Poetry's Dead, and a good thing, kick it while it's down, And so I was like, well, okay, let's say it's dead. Let's just go with dead. And here's deadism for you. And let's write a poetry of that, a poetry of kind of, humming at the funeral or singing at the gravesite or something that thinks about loss. And, it's funny to be here years later with this book that I hope does some version of that, is about singing.
Or even just those words drained of meaning in that Kaufman poem that you quote at the end of the essay. Remember where they don't mean anything.
Yeah, no, he has a poem called Oregon, and just like Oregon, the soul Oregon, the planet Oregon, Oregon, and then across from that is a poem untitled that says the sun is Negro, the earth is Negro, and he just says all these things are Negro, and you realize Oregon and Negro are anagrams of each other, and he's sort of playing with these kind of notions of color. I mean, I think Kaufman is terrific, so go out and read him. But, he's also in that anthology. I think some of those poems I'm mentioning, Oregon certainly is in there. And so, that's where I kind of find language as a resurrecting thing, as a thing that's always renewed.
Well, maybe Kevin could end with one poem.
Sure.
For us. Would you read the Keats poem?
Sure, yeah.
Tell me what page it's on when you find it.
It is, it's hard to find with one hand, but. It's called The Stair, and it's the start of the Purgatory section. It's on page 88. The stair. The heart, it hoards. How I know this. The small, strangled, shining room Keats lost his life in and to. Beyond the window, sunlight arranging itself on the Spanish steps while the poet watches. Sweet azure of the East. Outside, snapshots of the tourists and teenagers tired of what they don't know yet. What will become of us? Ash, unasking, the death mask made of Keats, no longer breathing. Look at it, not look at us. Beyond the window, the stairs stretch heavenward, stranded, without 1 ounce of shade.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks so much, Chris. So great to be here with you.